Some conversations last only a few seconds, yet they quietly change the direction of an entire lifetime. On a bright Saturday morning in downtown Seattle, the city's annual community charity gala welcomed families, local businesses, and volunteers into a renovated waterfront exhibition hall decorated with fresh flowers, warm lights, and long tables supporting neighborhood programs. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with soft laughter, children running between booths, and the comforting aroma of fresh coffee drifting through the air. Daniel Carter adjusted the sleeve of his faded blue work shirt before helping his 10-year-old daughter, Lily, place handmade birdhouses onto a display table for a fundraising auction. They had spent several weekends building every piece together inside their small garage. None of them were perfect, but each one carried careful craftsmanship and quiet love. "Dad, do you think anyone will buy these?" Lily asked while straightening one of the tiny wooden roofs. Daniel smiled without looking away from the last loose screw he was tightening. "If they do not, we still had a good time building them together." Lily laughed. "You always have an answer." Daniel finally looked up. "That is because I have a pretty smart partner." Lily grinned proudly before greeting another family walking past their booth. A few minutes later, a small crowd gathered near the center stage as the event organizers welcomed one of the largest sponsors of the fundraiser. Charlotte Bennett stepped inside wearing an elegant navy business suit that reflected quiet confidence rather than extravagance. As the chief executive officer of one of Seattle's fastest-growing technology companies, she was accustomed to formal introductions, business negotiations, and public attention. Yet today she moved through the room with genuine curiosity, stopping to speak with volunteers, thanking donors personally, and listening more than she spoke. Daniel noticed her only because several people politely stepped aside as she approached the display tables. He leaned toward Lily and whispered with a playful smile, "Looks like somebody important just arrived." Lily quietly whispered back, "Should we be nervous?" Daniel chuckled softly. "Only if she starts judging our birdhouses." Charlotte happened to overhear the last sentence as she stopped beside their booth. She examined one of the handmade birdhouses carefully before looking toward Daniel with an amused smile. "Actually," she said, "I think they have more character than most things people buy in stores." Daniel laughed. "That is the nicest thing anyone has said about my crooked woodworking." Charlotte picked up another birdhouse, gently running her fingers across the smooth wooden surface. "Who built these?" "My daughter designed them," Daniel answered proudly. "I only followed instructions." Lily immediately protested. "That is not true. Dad fixed almost everything." Charlotte smiled warmly at the easy affection between father and daughter. "Then I think you make a pretty good team." Daniel shrugged modestly. "We try our best." Their conversation continued naturally, almost as though they had known each other much longer than a few minutes. There was no awkwardness, no effort to impress one another, only the comfortable rhythm of two people who genuinely enjoyed listening. Charlotte asked about the project. Daniel explained how every dollar from the auction would support after-school programs, and Lily enthusiastically described which birds might someday live inside the little houses they had built together. Nearby guests occasionally smiled as they watched the unexpected conversation unfold. Then Daniel glanced at Charlotte with an expression filled more with humor than flirtation and said, "You know something? You would make a great bride someday." For a brief second, everyone within earshot became unusually quiet. Charlotte looked directly into his eyes before the corners of her mouth slowly lifted into an unmistakably warm smile. Daniel laughed with everyone else, slightly embarrassed but completely relaxed. Yet after the laughter faded, something unexpected remained. Neither Daniel nor Charlotte looked away immediately. In the middle of a crowded charity event where hundreds of conversations rose and disappeared like passing waves, two strangers quietly shared a moment that neither success, wealth, nor careful planning could have arranged, and although neither of them realized it yet, the simplest exchange of light-hearted words had already become the beginning of a story neither one had ever imagined. The charity gala ended as the afternoon sunlight slowly faded behind the Seattle waterfront, but the brief conversation lingered in both of their minds long after the exhibition hall had emptied. Daniel Carter loaded the last unsold birdhouses into the back of his aging pickup truck while Lily carefully counted the donation envelopes they had collected throughout the day. "We raised almost $1,000, she said excitedly. "That is enough to help a lot of kids." Daniel smiled as he closed the tailgate. "That is the best part of today." Lily climbed into the passenger seat before glancing at her father with a mischievous grin. "You embarrassed yourself a little. Did you know that?" Daniel laughed as he started the engine. "I had a feeling you were going to bring that up." Lily folded her arms dramatically. "You told a famous businesswoman she would make a great bride." Daniel shook his head with an amused smile. "I was only making a joke." Lily looked out the window as they drove away from the waterfront. She laughed. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. "She has a good sense of humor." The conversation slowly drifted toward homework, grocery shopping, and the baseball game Lily hoped to watch that weekend. Yet every so often Daniel unexpectedly remembered Charlotte's calm smile and the warmth in her reply. It was unusual because he rarely thought about strangers after meeting them. His life had become comfortably predictable during the years since losing his wife. Every weekday began before sunrise with breakfast, school drop-offs, repair jobs across the city, and evenings helping Lily with homework before they shared dinner together. There was peace in that routine. There was healing in its simplicity. Across downtown Seattle, Charlotte Bennett returned to the executive offices occupying the highest floors of her company's glass headquarters. Monday morning quickly filled with meetings, financial reports, product development updates, and conversations about future expansion. Her assistant placed another stack of documents neatly across the polished conference table. "The investors confirmed Thursday afternoon," he explained. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully before signing several pages. Normally, her attention never wandered during business hours. Today was different. During a short break between meetings, she found herself looking through the floor-to-ceiling windows toward Elliott Bay. The reflection in the glass reminded her not of quarterly earnings or board decisions, but of a little girl proudly explaining handmade birdhouses beside her father. One of the senior executives noticed her unusual silence during the afternoon meeting. "Is something concerning you?" he asked politely. Charlotte offered a small smile. "Nothing concerning. Just something worth thinking about." She surprised herself with the answer because she could not explain why such a simple family interaction had remained with her for 2 full days. It was not the joke itself she remembered most clearly. It was the ease with which Daniel treated everyone around him. He had spoken to the event volunteers exactly as he had spoken to the city's largest sponsor. There had been no hesitation, no attempt to impress, and no awareness of social status. Respect came naturally to him because it was simply part of who he was. Later that evening, Charlotte attended another formal business reception inside an elegant downtown hotel where conversations revolved around market trends, acquisitions, and investment opportunities. Crystal chandeliers reflected soft light across expensive suits and evening dresses, while polished speeches echoed through the ballroom. Everything appeared impressive. Yet for reasons she could not fully explain, the room felt strangely quieter than the laughter she had heard beside a folding table covered with handmade birdhouses only 48 hours earlier. Meanwhile, Daniel and Lily sat together at their small kitchen table, sharing homemade chicken soup while discussing her upcoming science project. The house was modest, the furniture was well used, and the evening was wonderfully ordinary. Lily suddenly looked up from her notebook and smiled. "Do you think we will ever see that nice lady again?" Daniel shrugged gently before taking another spoonful of soup. "Seattle is a big city." Lily nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes big cities still let people meet twice." Daniel smiled without answering because he believed life rarely worked that way. Neither of them knew that across the same city, another person was quietly asking herself the very same question. The following Saturday arrived wrapped in soft spring sunshine. And while most of Seattle welcomed the quiet weekend with farmers markets and neighborhood walks, Charlotte Bennett found herself driving through a part of the city she had rarely visited before. She had accepted an invitation to tour several community programs that her company's charitable foundation supported, hoping to better understand where future donations could make the greatest difference. The schedule was carefully planned, but one unexpected stop quietly changed the entire day. As Charlotte stepped out of her car beside a small neighborhood recreation center, she immediately recognized a familiar blue work shirt across the parking lot. Daniel Carter was kneeling beside an elderly man's wheelchair, adjusting a loose footrest with a simple wrench from his toolbox. "Does that feel better now?" Daniel asked with a reassuring smile. The older gentleman gently tested the repaired support before looking up gratefully. "Much better. You probably saved me another repair bill." Daniel shook his head. "I only tightened a few bolts." The man laughed warmly. "You always say that." Charlotte remained several yards away, speaking with the community director while quietly observing the interaction. A few minutes later, another resident approached carrying a broken folding chair. Before she could even ask for help, Daniel accepted the chair with the same patient smile he had offered everyone else. "Let me see what we can do." There was no sign advertising his services, no expectation of payment. He simply helped because someone needed help. The community director noticed Charlotte watching him. "You know him?" she asked. Charlotte smiled politely. "We met briefly last weekend." The director nodded knowingly. "Daniel has been volunteering here for almost 3 years. Whenever something breaks, someone eventually says, 'Call Daniel.'" Charlotte looked back toward him with quiet surprise. "Does he work here?" "No," the director answered. "He repairs homes all over Seattle during the week. Saturdays are usually for us." Charlotte said nothing for several seconds. There was something remarkably calming about watching a man solve ordinary problems without making anyone feel embarrassed. As the afternoon drew to a close, Daniel gathered his tools while Lily carefully packed the remaining craft supplies into storage boxes. Neither of them noticed Charlotte preparing to leave across the parking lot. Before getting into her car, she turned for one last glance. Daniel was standing beneath the warm afternoon sun, listening patiently as an elderly woman thanked him for repairing a loose handrail earlier that week. He simply nodded, wished her a wonderful weekend, and continued loading his toolbox without expecting another word of praise. Charlotte quietly closed her car door and remained seated for a long moment before starting the engine. She had met countless successful people throughout her career, but very few possessed the kind of quiet character that asked for nothing while giving so much. As she slowly drove away, one unexpected thought settled gently into her heart. Perhaps the most extraordinary people were not the ones standing on stages beneath bright lights. Perhaps they were the ones quietly holding the ladder while someone else climbed. The following week brought an unexpected opportunity that neither Daniel Carter nor Charlotte Bennett could have predicted. Seattle's Community Renewal Foundation announced a citywide neighborhood improvement initiative, inviting local business leaders and experienced volunteers to work together renovating public recreation spaces before the start of summer. Charlotte's technology company had agreed to become the primary sponsor, while the community center where Daniel volunteered had recommended him as one of the project coordinators because of his practical experience and calm leadership. Daniel arrived early on the first morning wearing his familiar blue work shirt, carrying a toolbox in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. Volunteers were already unloading lumber, paint, gardening supplies, and picnic tables from several trucks parked beside the playground. Birds chirped from nearby maple trees, while children laughed from the basketball court waiting for the day's activities to begin. Daniel immediately joined a small group assembling new benches without asking who was in charge. A few minutes later, another vehicle pulled into the parking area, and Charlotte stepped out wearing dark jeans, comfortable work boots, and a simple navy jacket instead of her usual executive attire. Several company managers followed behind her carrying boxes filled with gloves, safety glasses, bottled water, and donated equipment. One of the managers quietly asked, "Would you like us to prepare a separate work area for you?" Charlotte smiled and gently shook her head. "No, we are all volunteers today." As she walked toward the gathering, Daniel noticed her approaching and greeted her with the same relaxed smile he offered everyone else. "Looks like we meet again." Charlotte smiled warmly. Seattle suddenly feels much smaller. Daniel chuckled softly. Or maybe this project simply found the right people. Lily, who was helping organize paint supplies nearby, happily waved when she recognized Charlotte. "Hi. We built more birdhouses," Charlotte laughed. I was hoping you would. The morning quickly settled into a comfortable rhythm. Daniel patiently demonstrated how to reinforce aging picnic tables so they would last several more years, while Charlotte worked beside other volunteers painting playground fences and planting flower beds. Whenever someone asked Daniel a question, he explained each step with patience instead of rushing through instructions. Whenever someone thanked Charlotte for sponsoring the project, she redirected the praise toward the volunteers doing the work. During a short lunch break, everyone gathered beneath a large shade tent overlooking the park. Volunteers shared sandwiches, fresh fruit, and homemade cookies while conversations flowed easily between people from every background. Daniel handed Charlotte a bottle of water. You have paint on your sleeve, he said with an amused smile. Charlotte looked down and laughed. I suppose that is what happens when a chief executive officer spends the morning with a paint roller. Daniel smiled. It looks good on you. Charlotte raised an eyebrow playfully. Better than a business suit? Daniel thought for a second before answering honestly. It looks more comfortable. They both laughed, and the conversation drifted naturally toward family traditions, favorite places around Seattle, and the simple pleasures of weekends away from busy schedules. Daniel never asked about company profits or executive responsibilities. Charlotte never asked about income or personal struggles. Instead, they spoke about books, hiking trails, local coffee shops, and Lily's growing fascination with woodworking. As the afternoon sunlight stretched across the newly restored playground, several volunteers quietly noticed how naturally the two worked together. There was no effort to impress one another, no awkwardness created by differences in status, only the quiet ease of two people who genuinely respected each other's character. Before everyone packed up for the day, the community director gathered the volunteers for a group photograph beside the freshly painted recreation center. Daniel stood near the back holding his toolbox while Charlotte joined the front row beside several neighborhood children. Just before the camera captured the moment, Lily looked at both of them and smiled with innocent certainty. You two make a really good team. Neither Daniel nor Charlotte answered immediately, but as the camera shutter quietly clicked beneath the warm Seattle sky, both of them found themselves wondering why those simple words felt so unexpectedly true. Over the next several weeks, the neighborhood renovation project became part of Daniel Carter's regular routine, and without either of them planning it, it also became one of the few places where he and Charlotte Bennett continued crossing paths. Every Saturday morning, volunteers gathered before 8 o'clock, shared coffee from large paper cups, reviewed the day's work, and quietly transformed another corner of the community. New benches appeared beneath old maple trees. Fresh flowers brightened forgotten sidewalks. Playground equipment that had once looked tired welcomed children again with bright colors and careful repairs. Daniel worked with the same steady focus every weekend, arriving before almost everyone else and leaving only after every tool had been put away. Charlotte never announced when she would attend, yet she somehow managed to appear more often than her crowded calendar should have allowed. Their conversations remained easy, never rushed, and never forced. Did Lily finish her science project? Charlotte asked one Saturday while helping unpack gardening supplies. Daniel smiled proudly. She earned first place in her class. Charlotte clapped softly. I knew she would. Daniel laughed. She has been reminding me every day. Lily looked up from planting flowers nearby. Because it was a really big deal. Charlotte smiled. You are absolutely right. Small moments like these slowly became familiar. Daniel would explain how to repair a wooden fence without replacing the entire section. Charlotte would ask thoughtful questions and genuinely listen to every answer. She was accustomed to leading hundreds of employees. Yet beside Daniel, she never acted like the most important person in the park. She simply became another volunteer willing to learn. Others began noticing the quiet friendship growing between them. At first, the comments were harmless. A volunteer smiled and whispered, "Those two certainly work well together." Another joked that Daniel seemed to be the only person in Seattle who treated a famous chief executive officer exactly like everyone else. Daniel usually laughed and changed the subject. Charlotte simply smiled before returning to work. But outside the community center, curiosity spread much faster than either of them realized. A local business blogger published several photographs from the volunteer project, including one showing Charlotte and Daniel carrying lumber together while laughing about something only they had heard. The article praised Charlotte's commitment to community service, but readers quickly became more interested in the unidentified man standing beside her. Social media filled with harmless guesses, exaggerated stories, and endless assumptions from people who had never met either of them. By Monday morning, several employees inside Charlotte's company had quietly seen the photographs. During a break between meetings, two managers exchanged curious glances after recognizing Daniel from the articles. Charlotte happened to overhear one of them say, "I wonder who he is." She calmly closed the folder she had been reviewing and answered before anyone else could. "He is a kind man who volunteers every weekend." That should be enough. The room immediately became quiet. No one challenged her answer. Across town, Daniel knew nothing about the online conversations until one of his customers casually mentioned seeing his picture beside a successful business executive. Daniel politely smiled, finished repairing the customer's porch railing, and thought very little about it until that evening. After Lily had gone to bed, he searched the article on his old laptop. He read only a few paragraphs before quietly closing the screen. The comments were mostly friendly, but Daniel understood how quickly simple kindness could become public speculation. Sitting alone at his small kitchen table, he wrapped both hands around a cup of cooling coffee and stared through the window into the peaceful darkness outside. Charlotte deserved a life free from unnecessary gossip, and Lily deserved a childhood untouched by public attention. The next Saturday, before sunrise painted the Seattle sky with soft shades of gold, Daniel made a quiet decision. He would continue helping the community because serving others mattered deeply to him. But from that day forward, he would keep a careful distance from Charlotte Bennett, believing that sometimes the kindest thing a person could do was quietly step back before someone else had to pay the price for simple friendship. The following Saturday felt different from the moment the volunteers began arriving at the community center. The familiar laughter was still there. Children still chased one another across the freshly restored playground, and the smell of fresh coffee still drifted through the cool morning air. Yet Daniel Carter carried an unusual quietness that Lily noticed almost immediately. "Are you feeling all right?" she asked while helping unload gardening tools from the truck. Daniel smiled gently. "I am fine." Lily studied him for another second. "You are thinking too much again." Daniel laughed softly. "You know me too well." As more volunteers gathered, Charlotte Bennett stepped out of her car, carrying several boxes of flower seedlings donated by a local nursery. She instinctively searched the crowd until she spotted Daniel organizing work assignments beside the storage shed. Normally, he would have greeted her with an easy smile and a lighthearted joke. This morning, he simply nodded politely before returning his attention to the volunteer schedule. Charlotte noticed the difference immediately, but chose not to mention it. Instead, she joined another group preparing a garden along the walking path, while quietly observing Daniel from a distance. Throughout the morning, he remained exactly the same with everyone else. He patiently taught teenagers how to safely install new park benches. He thanked every volunteer who arrived. He knelt beside children to answer their questions without ever sounding impatient. Only one thing had changed. Whenever his work naturally brought him near Charlotte, he politely found another task waiting somewhere else. During lunch, volunteers gathered beneath the large canopy as they had every weekend before. Charlotte carried 2 paper cups of coffee toward the picnic table where Daniel was organizing blueprints for the final phase of the renovation project. "I thought you might like this," she said with her usual warm smile. Daniel looked up appreciatively before accepting the cup. "Thank you." A quiet moment settled between them. Charlotte finally asked the question she had been carrying all morning. "Did I do something wrong?" Daniel immediately looked surprised. "No, not at all." She searched his expression carefully. "Then why have you been avoiding me?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds before placing the coffee gently on the table. Around them, volunteers continued laughing and talking, but their corner of the park suddenly felt unusually still. "Charlotte," he said calmly, "people are beginning to notice us." She smiled softly. "People notice many things." Daniel slowly shook his head. "Some attention is harmless." Some creates problems that nobody deserves. Charlotte folded her hands together and listened without interrupting. You have worked very hard to build your reputation, Daniel continued. You lead an incredible company. You employ hundreds of people. I do not want careless stories or online speculation making your life more difficult because someone saw us talking too often. Charlotte looked at him with quiet disbelief before asking gently, "Have you really been protecting me?" Daniel smiled with the same humility that had first captured her attention. "I am simply trying to do the respectful thing." Charlotte lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at him. "Daniel, do you know what I have learned since meeting you?" He shook his head. "The people who truly matter in my life have never cared about headlines. They care about character." Daniel did not answer immediately. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of newly planted flowers across the park, while children laughed somewhere beyond the baseball field. Charlotte took one careful step closer. "If I start making decisions based on strangers who know nothing about either of us," she said quietly, "then I stop living my own life." Daniel looked into her eyes and saw neither frustration nor pride. He saw calm certainty. Before he could respond, Lily called from across the playground, "Dad, we need one more person to help plant the roses." Daniel smiled toward his daughter before looking back at Charlotte. For the first time that morning, his guarded expression softened. Without another word, they walked side by side toward the garden beds, and although neither of them realized it yet, that quiet walk marked the moment when fear slowly began losing its place to trust. Summer arrived quietly across Seattle, and with it came the completion of the neighborhood renovation that had brought so many strangers together. Fresh gardens bloomed beside newly painted walkways. Children filled the playground every afternoon, and families gathered beneath the sturdy picnic shelters that volunteers had rebuilt board by board. Although the official project had ended, Charlotte Bennett continued finding reasons to visit the community center. Sometimes she brought donated books for the after-school reading program. Other weekends, she delivered sports equipment or helped organize seasonal family events. Daniel Carter eventually realized she was no longer coming because of corporate responsibility. She came because she genuinely cared about the people. One warm Saturday morning, Lily was teaching several younger children how to build simple wooden bird feeders, while Daniel prepared extra lumber at a nearby workbench. Charlotte arrived carrying 2 large boxes filled with paintbrushes and craft supplies. Lily immediately waved excitedly. "You came back." Charlotte smiled as she set the boxes onto the table. "I promised I would." Lily looked inside one of the boxes and gasped happily. "These are exactly the colors we wanted." Charlotte laughed softly. "I had a little help choosing them." Daniel walked over, wiping sawdust from his hands with an old shop towel. "You really did not have to keep bringing things every weekend." Charlotte looked around at the children already gathering near the tables. "I know." She smiled warmly. "I wanted to." Daniel simply nodded. There was something comforting about how natural their conversations had become. Neither of them tried to impress the other anymore. They had quietly stopped noticing the differences between a successful chief executive officer and a neighborhood contractor because those differences no longer mattered during moments like these. As the morning passed, Charlotte sat beside Lily painting small wooden birds while listening carefully to stories about school, science projects, and favorite books. Lily spoke with complete honesty, the way children naturally do when they trust someone. "Dad always says people tell you who they are by what they do every day." Charlotte glanced toward Daniel, who was patiently helping another volunteer repair a loose garden gate. "Your father sounds very wise." Lily smiled proudly. "He does not think so." Charlotte looked back at the little girl. "Sometimes the wisest people never do." Later that afternoon, after most families had gone home, Daniel and Charlotte walked slowly through the community garden collecting empty watering cans. The golden sunlight filtered through tall maple trees, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming lavender across the quiet pathways. Daniel broke the comfortable silence first. "Thank you for spending so much time with Lily." Charlotte looked ahead with a peaceful smile. "She makes it easy." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "She does not open up to many people." Charlotte answered softly. "Neither do you." Daniel laughed quietly because she was right. As they reached the parking lot, Lily ran toward them holding a tiny wooden bird feeder she had just finished painting. "This one is for you," she said as she handed it to Charlotte. Charlotte accepted the small gift with genuine emotion. "Are you sure?" Lily smiled brightly. "Birds always come back to places where they feel safe." Charlotte looked from the little bird feeder to Daniel, and without anyone saying another word, all three quietly understood that somewhere along the way, what had begun as an unexpected meeting between strangers was slowly becoming the feeling of home. Autumn arrived with crisp mornings and golden leaves drifting through the streets of Seattle, bringing with it the annual Community Partnership Celebration hosted by Charlotte Bennett's company. Unlike previous corporate events held behind polished glass walls, this year's gathering was organized inside the renovated Neighborhood Recreation Center, where employees, local families, volunteers, and nonprofit organizations came together to celebrate what they had accomplished side by side. Colorful banners decorated the entrance, children played games across the freshly restored playground, and long tables displayed photographs documenting every stage of the renovation project. Daniel Carter almost decided not to attend. Recognition had never interested him, and he believed the work itself had always mattered more than public appreciation. Someone had to. Throughout the afternoon, guests toured the gardens, visited community exhibits, and listened to children perform music and short speeches about the changes they had witnessed in their neighborhood. Daniel quietly helped arrange folding chairs before carrying extra boxes for one of the nonprofit organizations, never realizing several company executives were watching him from nearby. One senior manager quietly asked Charlotte, "Does he always volunteer instead of enjoying the event?" Charlotte smiled softly. "That is exactly who he is." As sunset painted the sky with warm shades of orange and gold, the event host invited Charlotte onto the outdoor stage to deliver closing remarks. Hundreds of guests gathered across the lawn while soft lights illuminated the newly restored park behind her. Charlotte thanked employees, local sponsors, volunteers, teachers, parents, and neighborhood leaders for believing that small acts of kindness could transform an entire community. Then she paused. For several quiet seconds, she looked across the audience until her eyes found Daniel standing comfortably near the back beside Lily. "There is one person I would like everyone to recognize," she said gently. Daniel immediately lowered his eyes, clearly hoping someone else would step forward. Charlotte smiled knowingly. "He probably wishes I would choose someone else." When he reached Charlotte, she handed him a simple framed photograph showing volunteers working together beneath the summer sun. "This," she said quietly enough that only those closest could hear, "is what real success looks like." Daniel looked at the photograph for a long moment before answering with characteristic humility, "I only did what many others were doing." Charlotte gently shook her head. "No, you reminded us why we were doing it." The audience became completely silent, not because of dramatic words or grand gestures, but because everyone recognized the truth standing before them. In a world that often celebrated the loudest voices, the greatest honor that evening belonged to the man who had never once asked to be seen. And as Charlotte stood beside him with quiet admiration, while Lily watched with shining eyes from the front row, it became clear that the strongest foundations in life were never built with wealth or applause, but with steady hands, humble hearts, and the quiet dignity that inspired others to become better themselves. Nearly a year passed, and the little community center by the Seattle waterfront had become something far greater than anyone had imagined. The gardens were filled with blooming flowers through every season. Children laughed beneath the shade of mature maple trees, and the birdhouses that Lily Carter and her father had built during that first charity event now hung throughout the park, each one occupied by families of songbirds returning every spring. On a cool Saturday afternoon, the center celebrated its first anniversary with neighbors, volunteers, teachers, and families gathering once again beneath strings of warm lights that stretched across the courtyard. Daniel Carter stood quietly near the garden entrance helping a young volunteer adjust a loose sign, while Lily greeted children arriving with handmade crafts for the celebration. Charlotte Bennett walked through the familiar gates carrying nothing more than a homemade apple pie carefully wrapped in a kitchen towel. One of them quietly whispered, Our chief executive officer baked that herself. Charlotte laughed softly after overhearing the comment. I had a very good teacher. Daniel looked up with surprise. Who taught you? Charlotte smiled. An elderly neighbor in my apartment building. She said recipes only become family traditions if someone is willing to learn. Daniel nodded with quiet admiration. She sounds wise. The afternoon unfolded with music, children's games, and heartfelt conversations shared among people who no longer felt like volunteers, but like extended family. As the sun slowly settled toward the horizon, Lily gently tugged on Daniel's sleeve. Can we walk to the garden for a minute? She asked. Daniel smiled. Of course. Charlotte joined them as they wandered along the same flower-lined pathway where months earlier they had carried watering cans together while discovering how naturally peace could grow between two people. Everything looked both familiar and wonderfully changed. The roses they had planted now stood taller than Lily's shoulders. Butterflies drifted lazily above the lavender, and birds moved freely between the little wooden feeders hanging from nearby branches. I was hoping you might have forgotten. Charlotte shook her head warmly. Not a chance. Daniel looked toward the garden where children were laughing together before meeting her eyes once again. Back then I thought I was simply making an innocent joke. Charlotte's smile grew even brighter. She slowly lifted her left hand, where a simple wedding band reflected the golden evening light, and answered with the same calm warmth that had first captured his attention many months before. And it turned out I really did need a groom. Daniel looked at the ring before gently taking her hand in his. There was no cheering crowd, no grand announcement, and no dramatic celebration. Only the peaceful sound of children playing nearby, birds singing from the wooden houses they had built together, and the quiet happiness that comes when two people choose each other every single day. Lily ran back toward them with a joyful smile and slipped her hands into both of theirs. Together they began walking slowly toward the gathering of neighbors waiting beneath the glowing lights, not as three people whose lives had crossed by accident, but as a family built through kindness, patience, second chances, and quiet dignity. And perhaps that was the greatest miracle of all, because the strongest love stories rarely begin with perfect plans or extraordinary promises. They begin with ordinary people who choose respect before romance, grace before pride, and service before recognition, until one ordinary day they look around and realize they have quietly become the home they were searching for all along.